Hi, folks. Thanks for joining me today. We are talking about the wildfire situation here in Alberta. I'm Kyle Brittain. I'm a freelance video journalist and a former wildland firefighter, storm chaser as well. We've been out there documenting these wildfires in recent days. I've been joined today by a special guest, Mike Flannigan. He's a wildfire expert. A lot of respect for this gentleman. And today we're going to be talking about the fire situation, what's happening right now, and what we're going to be looking at in the coming weeks. So yeah, we'll just jump right into it, and I'll throw it over to you, Mike. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, and then what's going on there out in Alberta?
Great to be with you, Kyle. I'm Mike Flannigan. I've been studying fire and weather since day one, and so this is my passion. And so I'm glad to be on today and talk about it. What's going on in Alberta right now? 109 fires that are active. Of those, 28 are out of control, which means they're of concern. 400 total. Area burned is about 350,000 hectares, and the average year it's about 250,000 hectares for the last 10 years. So we've already exceeded our 10-year average. That's about 4 times the size of Calgary, if you can believe that. So it's a huge chunk of real estate that burns. It has burned this year and does burn on average. So this is, the current situation, mostly human caused. There are some lightning caused fires as well, mostly human caused, and which means they're preventable. So that's the current dashboard, and we'll look at the current satellites. And this is a mid-infrared. It's about 3.9 microns, which means it's very sensitive to high temperature. So the white, which is you hardly see, if you move your cursor there, Kyle, to northern Alberta, there's a few spots showing up there. That's Fox Lake over on the right. So it's a much quieter day, and we're seeing action on Twitter saying, oh, the rain's not changing anything, and they're partly right, okay? They're not going to put the fire out. There's not enough rain, but the fires are not spreading like they were Friday and Saturday, going like gangbusters. So the rain is making a difference, gives fire management an opportunity to do some work. And so let's go to the visible.
Oh, visible from today. Let's go to the visible from today. Yeah.
Yeah, let's do visible today before we take a look at Friday. Geocolor, that's the one there. Okay, and this is the GOES 18 satellite. It's from a Ramby slider. If you just put that in your browser, you'll find it. And it sits above the equator, and it rotates at the same speed as the Earth, and just has all these sensors and cameras and just takes pictures, and we get to see these. So here is close to what your eye would see. You can see Great Slave Lake is mostly or almost all ice covered. That's ice. And the white are clouds spreading through, bringing some rain and showers, much needed, to central, and now spreading into parts of northern Alberta. You can see the wind flow, and it's still windy in parts of northern Alberta, northeastern BC, and there's a bit of fire going on, but the clouds masking a lot of that right now. So let's go back a few days, and we'll go with Friday, which was a very active day, as was Saturday. And we'll check so here, once again, this is near visible, and you can see those long elongated plumes. That's smoke from these forest fires. And the longer and narrower it is, it means the stronger the winds. Slower the winds, it fans out. So it's telling you it was really windy, and it's been hot, dry, and windy, as everyone knows. And you can see bits of white pop in there. That's pyrocue. This is an example of a pyrocumulonimbus. Maybe we can talk about that another day, because they're really interesting. It means that the column's lifted enough. There's a lot of moisture in the combustion process, and it gets lifted. It cools, condenses, and forms clouds. And if the right conditions right, even a thunderstorm. So you can see lots and lots of fire. Let's go to the mid-infrared now for the same Friday period. And here, the bright white are very active fires, and you can see that they're really growing rapidly. And you see from the cluster where the mouse pointer is, you can see some black there. That means there's some moisture getting in there. It's getting thicker. That's actually picking that up. but you can see it's almost like measles south of Slave Lake, Lesser Slave, north of it, near Uticuma. Lots of things going on. So this was an extremely active day, as was Saturday. And you can kind of infer that upper ridge there. You can see the darker clouds going circling around. It's kind of tilted, not your north-south upper ridge that we often see, but as this upper ridge, starts to collapse, that's when we get all our problems. And this is a strong southeast flow. We've seen this before. We'll see it again. And it's a real problem for fires in May.
For sure. And I just wanted to look at today's NASA image. This is from Sunday afternoon, and we can see clearly that smoke that's been caught up in that upper level flow, and it's just venting way north there into the Canadian Arctic archipelago. So that's pretty gross here. I mean, they're getting a lot of wildfire activity in Siberia as well right now. So I wonder if we start seeing some of that coming across the top.
Yeah, we could. And the important thing about the smoke being transported up into the Arctic is eventually it does fall out, just from gravity or precipitation. And the charcoal accelerates the melting of the snow, ice, and Iceland with all that ice. So they call it dark ice. And if you're interested in that, Jason Box has a site called Dark Ice. Take a look at that sometime.
For sure. Yeah, and here's our past 24-hour satellite-derived wildfire detections in northern Alberta, and you can just see those, like you said, those elongated burn paths you can just really tell that southeasterly wind was driving these fires and that rapid rate of spread and that just rapid increase in the area burned with these fires, hey?
Yeah, and that's what caused the evacuations of Entwistle, Evansburg, Drayton Valley, Edson, parts of New Grand Prairie. Yeah, there's about 20-some thousand people been evacuated, and it's, for anyone who's been through it, it's quite a traumatic experience. And hope everyone's safe and all their stuff is safe. It's really, and just a short hats off to all the firefighters and first responders. They're working their butts off to keep our community safe.
Yeah. So that being said, here I'm gonna switch the view over, and talking about this May compared to previous Mays. Like, I mean, we think of wildfire season in Alberta. May is wildfire season here. I mean, it's when we have the spring dip, the winter snows melt away, and there's low foliar moisture content. You don't have much of the sap getting up into the trees yet, so the trees are really dry. You get the heat, and then you get the fires in May before the seasonal rains tend to come later on, late May, June, and then it kind of shuts down the season in the northern kind of boreal regions of Alberta, BC, and northern Saskatchewan. We think of other previous bad seasons, like 2011, when a third of Slave Lake burnt down in a fast-moving fire. Fort McMurray, of course, costliest disaster in Canadian history in May 2016, which kind of had similar antecedent conditions to this season. What makes this season so much worse than previous seasons, and how can we kind of compare that in terms of impacts, where we have these years that are seemingly really bad because of the impacts to the wildland urban interface, or years where we just have a lot of fire, and thankfully so far we haven't had much in the way of damage to structures, at least yet.
So, and I did 2019 Chuckade Creek in that. So it seems like every 3 to 5 years we have an event in May. Impact's important. I mean, we often use area burn, number of fires, because we have those numbers. Impact in terms of economic costs is a little more difficult, structures lost and things like that. So it's in some ways it's hard to compare. We can compare numbers and area burn, but this is a pattern. And May is our busiest month in Alberta. No other jurisdiction in Canada has that. And you say, well, why is May such a big thing? Kyle mentioned the spring window, spring dip. Absolutely. Snow's gone, and until things green up, you got all that dead organic material. It was a dry winter, as we saw, or we'll see, and it's easy for fires to start and spread. But there's 3 ingredients for a fire. You need something to burn. We call it vegetation. We call it fuel because we're fire people. Second, ignitions, human and lightning. Spring are dominated by human cause, summer by lightning. Most of the fires in Alberta right now are human cause. And third, hot, dry, windy weather, which we've had in spades. You have all 3 and you have a fire. So why is Alberta sticking out? Like BC had spring fires, Ontario gets spring fires, everywhere gets it. that's worse in Alberta. Two reasons. The weather patterns we see with these strong southeast flows, high pressure to the east, circulation clockwise, and low pressure to the west. So you get this southeast gradient, and it just, the stronger the highs and lower the lows, the stronger the gradient, the stronger the winds. And it seems to happen every spring. And these high pressure systems come down from the Arctic, so they're exceedingly dry. So relative humidities, 10, 12%, during the last few days when the winds were howling. So everything was set up. The other thing is human-caused ignitions. Alberta has a lot of human footprint activity on the landscape, whether it's industrial, recreational, or just population. Where there's people, there's fire. So more so that you look at northern Saskatchewan, and it's sparsely populated. Same with northern Ontario, Quebec, and Manitoba. So we've got more people, more activity, more human-caused fires. We've got the weather, bang, we've got a very active May. How does this compare to other Mays? Well, it depends what you want to look at. The number of fires, we're near the top. Area burned, we're close or near the top. Impact, well, Fort McMurray, for costs is off the scale. Hopefully we don't see anything like that.
Yeah, definitely. And we're definitely stick around till the end of the video, because we're going to talk a little bit more here in a little bit about what we might expect. But yeah, just like Mike was saying, this May has been quite exceptionally kind of dry and hot. And so we'll just share the screen here once again, show a couple of maps here. And just to kind of give us some perspective as to why things are the way that they are this spring, we saw this is the precipitation map, percent of average precipitation since September 1st. So through fall and the winter, it was very dry. We can see across much of Alberta here, we're at 40 to 60% of average. So half the average amount of precip we typically get. And then that, of course, that frees up. You just don't have that much in the way of soil moisture. And so, of course, that translates to, the ground starts to thaw in spring and it's very dry. We have very little in the way of soil moisture. So we saw a lot of grass fire activity. We've seen it's yet to green up in the forests and in the grasslands. We're just starting that process now, especially after that heat wave, but very dry, not a lot of soil moisture to work with. Today, we're actually seeing a fair amount of rain, not drought busting rain, but we got a fair bit across the province here. We can see this is radar-derived rainfall in central Alberta. Here's Edmonton here, Drayton Valley. And we know we've got a number of large wildfires in this area in particular, southeast of Edson. So, it's showing, like I say, this is not exact. This is radar indicated, but we've got little pockets there in excess of 16 millimeters of rain. And lots in excess of kind of 5 to 10 mils in some sections there. So that will help, as Mike was saying earlier, with these the fire suppression efforts in the coming days. But as the heat returns, the hot, dry, windy weather returns, we're going to start to see that fire danger ramping up once again. And so, with that.
And Kyle, these fires are so large, the perimeters are so large that, this rain, it's quieted down, but it's not out. So when the winds and heat return, they flare up. So it's quiet now, but it's just waiting for an opportunity to spread again.
Exactly. Yeah. So, even here today, we can see you might get a false sense of security looking at this fire danger map. You can already see the footprint of that rainfall through portions of west central northern Alberta here. And you're thinking, well, look at that. Fire danger is low, but it's very reactive to the current weather. 2-3 days of 30 degrees and some high winds, and this will be bright red, extreme fire danger all over again here. So we can just see again on the Alberta map here today, we can see the footprint of that rain and that forecast rain through western and north central Alberta here. Still very dry across far northern Alberta, but once we start to see the return of warm, dry weather later in the week, of course, we're going to start to see that fire danger ramping up once again. So yeah, we were talking about what constitutes that extreme fire behavior, fire weather, which is hot, dry, windy conditions. And as we saw in the last few days, these were very much wind-driven fires. We have some fires that can burn really intensely with, the winds aren't as strong. The fire paths are kind of a little bit more chaotic. They can get blown around by thunderstorm outflows or These were very wind-driven fires. Some fires in certain situations, especially when we start to see this upper ridge, the next upper ridge break down, we can start to see favorable conditions for pyroconvection, which we talked about briefly. Maybe we'll talk about that maybe a little bit later this week if we do another meeting. Yeah, and that's just another form of extreme wildfire behavior. We can get these like fire-generated thunderstorms. We did get some pyrocumulonimbus activity in parts of Alberta this week, which is a sign of that, that deep convection. And what sorts of things can we see, just briefly, with pyroconvection? Like sort of fire behavior is going on the ground that's driving that?
So, we have really great fire behavior models, danger rating system, and they work quite well for wind-driven fires. But for these fire-generated thunderstorms, they have exceedingly high intensities and extreme inflow and outflow winds that can come from these beasts that can change the direction, change the speed, and they're really erratic and dangerous situations. So avoid anything like a pyro CB, because you're never quite sure what's going to happen. There's just so much energy in these fire-generated thunderstorms, pyro CBs. And they can start new fires, like we saw in BC in 2021, and the Fort McMurray fire actually started new fires because they generate lightning, and they generate rain and hail sometimes too. But we're actually starting to see a trend of more pyro CBs today than in the past, and that's concerning.
For sure. And just in terms of being like a wildland firefighter, like I used to do that on the ground. In these types of situations, it's just a very humbling feeling when you just, on these days where you have these pyrocumulonimbus, giant fire generated thunderstorms, or these wind-driven events where the flames are just like, we're talking, 50, 100 foot plus flame lengths above the trees. You have these continuous crown fires where the fire gets right up into the upper canopy of the trees. It's really hot, intense burning fires. It's just very difficult to action these fires on the ground. You can't get boots on the ground anywhere near this type of fire behavior. Typically, you might have personnel maybe behind the fire, kind of working up the flanks, but you won't be anywhere near the head of the fire. And even then, like if you have the aerial suppression, like water bombers and fire retardant being dropped from these big planes, it doesn't do much, does it? When it gets extremely hot and that fire behavior is just so intense on the head of the fire, it seems like you can't do much to stop it during the kind of peak burning, like 5 o'clock late in the afternoon. You kind of have to really action those fires later in the day, right? And we have like this fire flap of suddenly you have all these wildfires going off at once. You have, provincially, you're trying to prioritize these fires according to human life and communities and watersheds and soils and natural resources and infrastructure. And you have a limited amount of resources and all these fires are going off at once. It can be very hectic and very chaotic. And like Mike was saying earlier, lots of respect for those engaged in this fire suppression right now, because it is not easy. It's very, very humbling experience, isn't it?
So yeah, you said it a lot, Kyle. I mean, direct attack on these running crown fires is not going to be successful. So you have to use indirect if that's possible. And that's where you lay a new fire backing into the wind in front of the wildfire and a burnout operation. And eventually the wildfire hits the burnout and it's got no fuel. It's very effective as long as you have the time and the winds aren't changing directions, which could cause more problems. And that's why we have evacuations. At times you have to just get out of the way because there's not much we can do.
Yeah, for sure. How about we'll break down the forecast here as promised. We're going to talk about what's to come here this week. And to be honest, a little bit concerned about the forecast in the mid-range. What we're seeing here, this is height anomalies at 500 millibars. That's about the middle of the troposphere, just showing that we have a really deep, warm air mass here over Western Canada. Not unlike what's the so-called heat dome in 2021, late June, that kind of precipitated the BC fire event and fire season around that time. Of course, it is a little bit earlier in the year, so we wouldn't expect those sort of 40, 50 degrees Celsius temperatures. But certainly if this does come to pass, as we are expecting, a lot of models are agreeing that we're going to be moving into another upper ridge pattern here. And upper ridge just means that you've got a ridge of high pressure through the atmosphere here. That means you've got large scale sinking air, clear skies, hot temperatures. And especially when you're on the east side and underneath this upper level ridge, it's going to be sunny and hot. This is a signal here that it's anomalously hot. Likely at the surface, as a result of that, we're going to be seeing anomalously high temperatures across the region, perhaps even record-breaking once again, which would bring us into the low 30s. And of course, as we've been talking about, hot, dry, windy weather is of great concern for potential wildfire weather. We're also seeing that signal here in precipitation through mid-May. It looks like kind of the peak of that heat could come late next week into early the following week. So hot, dry, and potentially windy here. As we can see, there's some pockets of high winds at times, depending on what we have going on at the surface. If we have thunderstorm activity that starts to come on the west side of that, like we look at this ridge here, once this ridge starts to phase to the east and we get downwind of this trough here, you start to get large scale rising air, which can be favorable for the development of thunderstorms as well as pyrocumulonimbus type clouds. And especially once you start to get that pattern change between the hot and the colder temperatures, you can have those higher winds. So those are the days of the greatest concern that we can see with fire danger. We're certainly going to want to be watching out for that.
Kyle,
yeah,
I like to think the ridge is air sinking, warming, and drying. And so even if you've had some rain and the fuels are wet, especially the fine fuels, they only need a day to dry out, really. So you get nice hot weather that you just described. It dries out all the fuels. So everything's primed. And then that ridge breaks down. And fire researchers have known for decades, the breakdown of the upper ridge, watch out, all right? Because you can get the thunderstorms, you get the wind, the cold front passages. Work done by a colleague of mine looked at May fires in Alberta, and 25% of the cases were the strong southeast winds. 50% of the cases were prefrontal or frontal associated with the breakdown of the upper ridge. So this is a classic pattern. It's a bit far off before, I'd say batten down the hatches. Like earlier last week, I was saying batten down the hatches because it was bang on. This is far enough away that I'm saying, let's take a closer look at it in a few days, and then we'll say better. But it's something to keep an eye on for sure.
Absolutely. And just to close out here, I mean, this is not really anything that folks that are living in those regions want to hear. Typically like to have nice, sunny, hot weather and just go enjoy the beautiful spring, especially after the kind of colds earlier spring that we had. How can folks prepare that live in these areas? What can they do? How should we be thinking about this next potential heat event that we're going to be having? What are we going to be looking at potentially in the next week or two? So
practically, if you see a wildfire, report it right away. 310 Fire in Alberta. There's also an Alberta Wildfire app that's very useful for information. Observe your fire bans, which covers much of the province, and just be careful. Very simple things can start a fire. People park their cars on dry grass, and your muffler, if it's a gas-powered car, it's hot and can start a fire. Quads can start fire. Just be really careful from if you're in an area that you might be subjected to a wildfire, have a go bag ready so that you have key documents, photographs, personal stuff ready to go if you have to evacuate. Hopefully that won't be the case. And of course, there's FireSmart. Check firesmart.ca website. 7 principles to help communities and homeowners protect themselves from wildfire.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot for your expertise, Mike. We had a good chat here. We're likely going to be talking more about this in the coming days, so certainly going to want to stay tuned. And if you have any questions, please leave them in the comments. We will do our best to answer those.
Just before we go, Kyle, maybe next time we could talk about an active May. Does that mean it's going to be an active summer?
Exactly. What's in store in the long run?
I don't think so, but let's discuss that more fully.
Sounds good. All right. Thanks, Mike. Thanks for everyone for joining. We'll talk to you next time.